Svelte is a popular and up-and-coming JavaScript framework that provides an alternative for developers to React and Vue.js. In this set of videos, we're going to look at Svelte and we're going to build an interactive CRUD application that allows users to view a list of films on a page and allows users to filter these films by particular tags. We can also, using a form, add new films to the database, and that's going to send that request from Svelte to the backend and store that data in the database, which can then be retrieved on the list view. As well as that, we also have these tags in the system, so we can filter down the movies by the different tags, and we can dive into an individual film and see more details about that film, including a description, a title, and the director of the movie. We can also update existing details, including the image that was used for that movie, and that's all going to coordinate with the backend in order to do so. And finally, we can also remove some films from our system using the delete button here, and you can see that that's removed that from the database. We're going to build this entire application from start to finish using Svelte and Django, including using Django REST framework for our API. And the purpose of this set of videos is to learn the basics of Svelte and how to integrate it with a backend. So let's get started now, and we're going to go to the Svelte introduction. This is documentation for Svelte. We're going to start by introducing this framework, and if you're not interested in this, you can skip in the description to the next section of the video. This is going to be an overview of Svelte and SvelteKit. You can skip to the code if you're not interested in this. Now, as it says in this page, which I'll link below the video, there is an interactive tutorial that you can use to get started with Svelte if you've never used it before, but we're going to focus on this here. What is SvelteKit? Now, SvelteKit is a framework for rapidly developing robust and performant web apps using Svelte. And if you're familiar with React, SvelteKit is to Svelte what Next.js is to React. And similarly, we have Nuxt.js in the Vue.js world. That is the equivalent to SvelteKit here. So let's move down here. What is Svelte? Svelte is a way of writing user interface components. So it's a component-driven library. And Svelte includes a compiler which converts these Svelte components that you build to JavaScript. And that JavaScript can then be run to render the HTML for the page and the CSS that styles that page. So Svelte itself is just about rendering these UI components, and you can render an entire page with just Svelte, but if you want to do more than that, if you want to write an entire application, it's best nowadays to use SvelteKit. And SvelteKit, as it says here, it helps you build web apps that follow modern best practices, and it includes some important functionality that we're going to use, such as a router that allows you to update the user interface when you click links in the application. So it gives you that feeling of going from one page to the other in this single page application. And among other things such as build optimizations, SvelteKit also gives you different rendering options. These are configurable. For example, some parts of your app could be rendered on the server with server-side rendering, others with client-side rendering, and we also have build time rendering here, or pre-rendering. And when you install SvelteKit, you're going to use Vite with a Svelte plugin, and that's going to allow you to reflect changes to your code in the browser instantly. So it's going to provide a very fast and feature-rich development experience, and it's using Vite to do that. So I'm going to go to the Vite documentation. We're going to very quickly have a look at this library too, and then we're going to start coding after that. As it says, Vite is a build tool that aims to provide a faster and leaner development experience for modern web projects. So the two main parts to Vite are a development server that allows you to do hot module replacement. In other words, when you make changes, the browser is instantly going to reload and reflect those changes, and that's very good for developer experience as you develop this code. And Vite also provides a build command that will bundle your code with rollup. So when you're finished with development and you want to deploy to a server, for example, you can run the build command to generate the final assets, and it's going to use rollup to do that. We don't actually need to know anything about this. All we need to do, or all we need to know, is that when we install SvelteKit, we're going to get this Vite set up as well. So with that said, let's go back to the Svelte documentation. And at the top left on the sidebar, we have this link here to create a project. So we're going to create a project by following these commands, and you will need Node.js installed. I've got the LTS installed on my system just now. We're going to copy the npm create command, and we're going to open a terminal now, and we're going to start coding. So I'm going to open up VS Code, where I have a folder open, and this folder currently has nothing in it at all, and we have a terminal open in VS Code. I'm going to paste the command into this terminal. So it's the npm create command, and we're using the Svelte latest tag here. So we're running npm create Svelte latest, and then we give the application that we're about to create a name. And the name that I'm going to give here, let's just call it film front end, and then we can execute the command, and that's going to install this create svelte package. We can proceed with that, and we're going to get some other questions, I think, in this installation process. So let's let it run through here, and then we have this welcome to SvelteKit message here. We're going to select a template, and let's just select a skeleton template here. Once we've selected that, we have the ability to add type checking with TypeScript. I'm going to select no to that. We don't want to use TypeScript in this introduction. And then we have further options to add things like ESLint and Prettier. I'm actually not going to select any of these, and then we can go on with the tutorial. After those questions, we have a new directory called film frontend, which was the name of the application, and we have some next steps listed out at the bottom. For example, we can cd into that new directory and run the npm install command, and what that's going to do is install all of the packages that are in the package.json file. We have some dependencies here, for example Svelte and Vite, and also SvelteKit as well. We're going to install those with the npm install command. Once that's done, we're back to the terminal, and now we can start coding using SvelteKit. So what we're going to do to start with is we're going to take a look at a page in the Svelte documentation, and it's a page on routing. And I think in America you might be saying routing, and other parts of the world, here we say routing, so I'm going to keep saying that throughout the tutorial. What we're going to do is we're going to examine how SvelteKit does this routing. And as it says here, at the heart of SvelteKit is a file system based router. And the roots of an application in SvelteKit, i.e. the URLs that the users can access, they are defined by the directories in the code base. And as it says here, we have a source directory in the code, and you can see that here on Visual Studio Code on the left hand side of this starter code from the command that we ran. And within there we have a roots directory, and I'm going to try and say this, that is the root. Maybe I should be using American terminology here, that's the route. And underneath that, we can create additional roots that represent pages or URLs in our application. So for example, the source/roots/about page is going to create a URL/about in the application. And we can also use URLs that contain parameters that can be used to load data dynamically. We'll see that later in the video. Now if we go back to the starter code, as I said, we have the source directory and we have this roots directory that contains this file here. It's called +page.svelte. And this is the naming convention for the actual pages, the components at that particular root. They have the name +page.svelte, and you can see that the highlighting is changed here a bit, and that's because I've just installed a plugin that you can find on VS Code. There is a Svelte for VS Code plugin that provides support and syntax highlighting for Svelte projects. And this is basically a Svelte component. It's a very basic one. It contains a header 1 tag with the message welcome to SvelteKit and then a link to the documentation. So how do we run that and have a look at this page? What we can do is go back to the package.json file and we can run this dev script. And behind the scenes that's going to run this vite dev command, and that's going to start the development server. So let's make the terminal bigger and we're going to run that dev command with npm run dev, and we're going to see that that's going to start a server now on localhost, and the port is 5173. So let's visit this page in the browser, and we're getting this page at the root of the application because it was defined at that particular location within the roots directory. And we have the header 1 and the link to the documentation. So that's our first component that comes by default when we install this project using the npm create command. What I'm going to do, because we're building a film list application, is I'm going to go back to VS Code, and under the roots directory I'm going to create a new folder. Remember, this is file system based routing, so we can create a new folder here which I'm going to call films, and within that we can create the file with the name +page.svelte. And let's make the terminal smaller. We have the server running in that terminal. We'll keep that running at the moment. And we can write the code for the film page within this file that we've just created. Now this naming convention with the page.svelte file, this is a bit strange at first, but you will become used to that if you use Svelte a lot, and it becomes quite normal after a while. So let's start writing our Svelte component here. We can just write a script tag, and then we can start defining variables. For example, we can set the name of the film, or the name of a film, to the Godfather, and then below the script component we can also write HTML code. So what I'm going to do is simply define an h1 tag here, and we're going to render out the name of the film, and we can use this syntax here in order to do that with the curly braces. And we can also define within the component some styling, and I'm going to do that at the bottom. And let's give the h1 some style. We're going to give it a font size of 40 pixels, and we're also going to give it a background color of red, which will not look good, but it's going to demonstrate what's going on in this particular component and what we can actually use in the component. So we have a script tag, we have some HTML, and we have a style tag defining the CSS styling for this component. And this styling, by the way, is scoped to the HTML elements that you see in this component. So any other components, this will not apply that style to those components. So let's save this file and go back to the browser, and I'm going to go to the URL at the top here. And remember, we're using this file system based routing, so we have a endpoint called /films here in the project. If we go there, we see the text for The Godfather, and the background color here is red as well. Let's go back to VS Code. Just to reiterate, when you create a component in Svelte, you can define any JavaScript code within the script tags, and then what's actually rendered on the page is decided in this HTML section here, and you can have nested elements, of course, within this HTML. And finally, have a style tag, and within a component you can apply any styles you want to the elements within that component. And we render the data within the script tags in the HTML dynamically using these curly braces, and this can be used to apply any JavaScript expression. So for example, we can run the toUpperCase function to convert the name of the film entirely to uppercase, and if we go back to the page, you can see that's automatically been reloaded and the name is now in uppercase. So that's the hot reloading that's provided by Vite. Let's go back to VS Code now. We're now going to see how to use conditional expressions in the HTML for a component. So I'm going to remove the style tag here, and we're also going to remove the h1 tag. And we want to check if the film begins with the capital T. So what I'm going to do is define an if statement using Svelte here. So we can do the curly braces, and then we can define an if statement with the hash symbol and then if. And we're going to check if the film starts with using the JavaScript starts with function, and we pass in the letter T here, and we can define an else clause using this syntax here where we have the curly brace and then a colon, and finally we can end this if expression with this syntax here, just a / and then the if statement. So what we can do within each expression is we can add the HTML we want to render if that condition evaluates to true. So if the film starts with T, I'm going to paste in a comment here just informing the user that it does start with T. And in the else clause, we're going to paste in this expression here that the film does not start with T. So let's save this file. We're going to go back to the page now, and you can see we get the message that it starts with T, and that's because in the if statement, this is evaluating to true. We have a film, The Godfather, it starts with T. If we change that T to another letter, for example F, we're going to get the other message here that it does not start with T. So that's how we use conditional expressions in Svelte. Now let's start building out a film list here. This page that we have here is ultimately going to list out some films that we have in the database in the end. So we need to have a list of films being stored in this component, and data like that is stored within the script tag. So what I'm going to do now is remove this hard-coded value, and we're going to paste in another one, and this is an array, a JavaScript array that contains an object, and this object represents a single film that we have in the system. It has an ID, a name, and a director. Now what we're going to do is we're going to see how to loop over all of the films in this array, and there is only one, but we're going to see the syntax now. Let's remove this conditional expression, and we're going to see something different now. We're going to define an unordered list, and within that we're going to loop over the films using the each expression in Svelte. So we're going to loop over each one of the films in that list, and we are going to alias each one of them as film at each iteration. And we could end the each block with that syntax there, just like the if block that we just saw. And then within the unordered list, we're going to define a list tag and render out the name of the film that we are iterating over. We're going to use film.name, and we use the dot property because each one of the films is a JavaScript object, and we want to access the attribute name within that object. So we can render that out. Let's go back to the page now, and you can see we get the Godfather in an unordered list. And we can replicate this down to the line below, so we can create 2 films within that list, and if we save the file you can see they're both listed out on the page, and that's because we're looping over each film using this each expression in Svelte. Now later on we're going to fetch the films that are going to be shown on this page from a back-end database using Django REST framework, and in a future video we'll use the SvelteKit back-end functionality to do that as well. So we're going to fill out this page later on with some real data. Let's now add a detail page. So we have a film here called The Godfather. Let's imagine we could click that film and we're taken to a new URL, and let's say The Godfather has an ID of 1, so the URL that we're going to go to would be /films/1. So that's a detail page for an individual film. Let's go back to VS Code. What we're going to do is define that detail page within our routes directory here. And again, I'm going to go back to the Svelte documentation on routing here, which I'll link in the description of the video. If we want to define a route with a parameter, we can use this syntax here. So the folder name, the directory name here in our file system is going to be defined using these square brackets to indicate that what we're expecting as the value is a dynamic value. So let's go back to VS Code, and within the films directory we are going to define another directory. So we'll create a new folder, and because it's dynamic we use these square brackets here, and we're going to reference the ID, and that's going to be the ID of the film that we're actually referencing or accessing from the back end. And again, within that directory, to create the page, we will create the page.svelte file here, and for now I'm going to copy paste an h1 tag saying detail page into this page, and we can save that and go back to the browser, go back to our application. If we go to /1 you can see we get that header. So what I'm going to do now is add a link from this page to each film's detail page. And to add a link using Svelte and SvelteKit, we only need to use native HTML anchor tags. So let's go back to the film list component here. We have the li tag here. What we're going to do is create an anchor tag within that, and we're going to use the href attribute here, and we're going to refer to a route here, films/film.id. So we're linking to the film detail page here, and don't forget to close off the anchor tag at the end here. So we have the list element, and within that list element we are creating the link to the film ID page, and we're referencing dynamically the film's ID, and this ID is a property within the objects that comprise this list of films. So we are referencing that. And if we go back to our page and we refresh this page, you can see that we have these links that take us to the detail page for each film in the list. Now this works, as I said, with native anchor tags, and this is maybe some would say better than React, because something like React would use React Router to achieve this functionality, but Svelte uses native HTML, and using those native HTML elements, in my opinion, that's better than having to define all these custom components. We can just stick to the web standards that we know best and that have been built up over the years. So we're just using anchor tags in this case. So that's how we reference the link to the film page. Let's go to that detail page now. And what we need to do is we need to actually get the ID from the URL. If we look at the URL that's generated when we click this link, we have the ID of the film in the URL. How do we actually get access to that within the detail page here? We're going to do that now. So in order to see that, let's go back to the Svelte documentation on routing. Now we've already seen the page.svelte component, which defines a single page in your application. If we scroll down a bit further here, we're going to come to this page.js section. And as it says here, often a page will need to load some data before it can be rendered. And for that, we can add a page.js module that exports a load function. And that's exactly what we need to do here. We need to get access to the ID in the URL before this component can be rendered. So we're going to create a page.js file to do that. And we're going to add that alongside the film detail route here. So within the ID folder, let's create a new file, and it's going to be called page.js. And actually I should have called this pluspage.js, so let's change the name of the file to that. Now I'm going to go back to Svelte's documentation just to get an understanding of what we need to put into this page. On the left hand side there is a tab here for loading data, and if we need to get data from the URL, for example, we can define some logic in this page.js file and export that load function. So what I'm going to do here is copy this load function, and we're going to paste this into the page.js file, and you can see that that takes params as an argument. And these params refer to this here. As you can see, we've defined this route with a dynamic parameter called ID. We're going to remove the code within the return statement, and we can get access to that ID and return it as a key in this object by using those params and getting the ID from those params. So basically whichever ID is in the URL will be passed through to this load function as a parameter, and we're going to be able to access that and any other IDs or any other parameters in the URL in this load function. So this parameter here matches up with the dynamic parameter in the URL root. And if we go back to the documentation for Svelte for this page data, you can see that any return value from this load function that we've just defined, that is available to the page via the data prop. And you can see an example of that in the component here for the page.svelte file. We are creating this variable here within the script tag with the export let data statement. So we're going to copy that. We're going to go back to VS Code and go to our detail page here. And above the h1 tag, we're going to define a script here for the Svelte component. And then we're going to paste in that export let data statement. And then within the h1 tag, let's remove detail page. And we're going to refer to data.id. Remember that the ID was exported here. That was the key in this object that's returned by the page load function. So the ID is available here, and we can access that on the detail component by getting a reference to that data with the export let data statement, and then we use that here to access that ID field. So let's save this and go back to the application. We're going to see that now we have the URL /films/1. We get number 1 on the page here. If we change that to 5 or 56, let's say, we're getting that same ID displayed on the page. So now we have access within the detail component to the ID of the film that we're looking at. So this is all working fine, but again, we don't have any proper persistence. We don't have a database at the moment. We're going to add all of that later. Let's now introduce the concept of stores in Svelte. Now, a store is a place to centrally store data that's going to be used by multiple Svelte components. You can see at the moment we have 2 components, and this one has defined some state called films, and the other one that we have, which is the detail component, that is just getting that data at the moment, but we could of course define any other data that we want here. Now what we're going to do is imagine a scenario where both of those components have to get access to the same data. We can use stores in order to do that, so I'm going to remove that there, and we're going to go to the documentation, and this is actually the interactive documentation that's provided by Svelte. Let me make this a little bit bigger on the left here. As it says, not all of your application state belongs inside the app's component hierarchy. Sometimes you'll have values that need to be accessed by multiple unrelated components or by a regular JavaScript module. So Svelte uses stores in order to do that, and a store is simply an object that has a subscribe method that allows interested parties to be notified when the store value changes. So what I'm going to do in order to create a store is go back to VS Code, and within the source directory I'm going to create a file here, and let's call it filmstore.js. So this is just a JavaScript file, and what we're going to do in this file at the top is we're going to import an object called writable, and that's going to come from the module svelte/store. And then once we've imported that writable object, we're going to export a film store here. We'll call it film store, and that's going to be an instance of this writable object. So we instantiate that, and we can pass a list of films in this case. And what I'm going to do is go back to the film list page. Let's remove this one here, and what we're going to do is copy this object, and we're going to move it into the store. So this is a central location to store our films. So let's copy paste that object in there. So we instantiate the writable, which is imported from the svelte/store module, and then within that we're passing some initial data, and it's an array containing a single object at the moment. If we save that, we can go back to the film list component, and we can remove this hard-coded film from the component, and we're now going to import the film store from this film store module that we just defined. So we exported that with a name of film store, so let's copy that, and we're going to import that, and it's going to be from this directory here. So we're going to go back to the root directory, and it's filmstore.js. And actually we don't need the JavaScript extension, we can just reference the film store here. So we have our film store imported here. Let's now define an empty JavaScript array called films. And what we're now going to do is use that film store, and we're going to call its subscribe method, and we pass a callback function to that. That callback function will get the values that are in the store at the given time as an argument, and then we can update the value that we've got in our state with those new values. So the films, that's the empty list that we have. When the component loads, it's going to set that to the values that are in the store when we call this subscribe method. And we can keep the rest of the code as it is. We're iterating over the films here and we're listing them out with an li tag and a link to the film detail page. Let's go back and see if that's still working now that we've moved the films out of the component. So I'm going to remove these parameters from the URL. We're getting the Godfather, that's the only film in the store that we defined, and of course we can still click through to the detail page. If we go back to the film store here, I'm going to go back to filmstore.js. Let's add another film here. So I've added The Big Lebowski by the Coen brothers. If we go back to the page again, this time it has that second film on the list page, and these values are coming from the store. And if you look at the film list component here, what we're doing is we're importing that store, we're defining an empty array, and then we're filling that array with the values from the store using the subscribe method of the film store. And the subscribe method allows us to detect when something has changed in the store, and that should be automatically reflected on this page if that happens. Now we should also unsubscribe to the film store when this list component is unmounted. And a component is basically, it's unmounted when we navigate away from this route. I'm going to go back to some documentation here on Svelte. Again, I'll link all of these below the video. It turns out when you call the subscribe method on a store, it returns an unsubscribe function. So let's get a reference to that function. If we go back to the documentation, we're going to store this in a variable called unsubscribe. So that is returned by the store.subscribe method. So we store that in a variable called unsubscribe, and we want to call this function, this unsubscribe function, when the component is unmounted. Now it turns out that Svelte has some lifecycle hooks, very similar to React, that we can import here. And what we're going to import is a hook called onDestroy. So let's import that from the Svelte library. And in order to call this unsubscribe method when the component is destroyed, what we can do is use that onDestroy hook, and we pass the callback in here. And as it says in VS Code, the function that we pass in, it schedules a callback to run immediately before the component is unmounted. So that function is just going to be the unsubscribe function that we get back when we call subscribe here. And again, this is referenced in the documentation here. We get a reference to the unsubscribe method, but that still needs to be called, and we do that through the onDestroy lifecycle hook. Now there is a shortcut for doing this. If we scroll down a little bit here, Svelte has a trick up its sleeve. You can reference a store value by prefixing the store name with the $sign. So let's see how this can reduce the boilerplate code. Actually, we can remove everything that we've got here, including the onDestroy hook, and we just import the store from the film store module. And I'm going to copy the name of this film store, and we're going to reference it within the loop that we've defined here, but we prefix it with the $sign, and that allows us to get the value that's within the store. Let's go back to our page and make sure everything is still working. So if I refresh this page, you can see we still get the two films that are in our store. So everything is still working, but that has reduced the code significantly. We don't need to import the onDestroy hook, and we also don't need to call that subscribe function. Instead, we can reference the value directly just by prefixing the store name with that $sign. So this is great, it's working fine on our list page. If we go to the detail page, we're also going to need this film store. So let's copy the import and go to the detail page. And right at the top of the script, we're going to import that film store. And what we need to do here is use the ID that we've extracted here using this page load function here. And that comes from the URL. We need to use that ID and look up the film by its ID in this film store. If we go back to the store, you can see that each film has an ID. So we need to look up the correct film based on the ID that's been passed into this component. And we're going to use JavaScript's array.find method in order to do this. So I'm going to create a variable here called film. And again, we're going to reference with the $sign that film store, and we're going to call the .find method. And we can do that because the value that's stored in that store, it's a JavaScript array, so we can call .find. And what we're going to pass in here is a function. So we're getting each film in the store, and we're going to look up if the film's ID is equal to that ID from the URL. So we reference that ID as you've seen below with data.id. This time we're using that ID from the URL, and we're looking up each item in the store, and we're extracting only the film whose ID matches this ID in the URL. Now we have a problem. I've directly copied the film store from the other module, but we are one directory deeper into this application, so we need to do that, and that's then going to work accordingly. So let's just console log this film to see if we're fetching the correct film here, and go back to this page here. I'm going to bring up the console, and if we click the Godfather, you can see we get back the correct object from that store. If we go back again and click the 𝗖𝗵𝗽𝗀𝗲𝗲, this time we're getting the other object, so we're getting the right object from the store. So what we want to do is show some basic details on this page. Let's go back to this, and we're going to change the HTML that's being rendered. If we found a film using that find function, we'll use an if statement to check for that. And if we have a film, what we're going to do is create a paragraph tag here, and we're going to reference the film's name, and we're going to say with a comma here, directed by, and then we'll reference the film's director. So if we find a film, we'll display that message there. Then we're going to define an else clause here, and that means that no film has been found. So let's create another paragraph tag, and I'm going to paste in a message here, no film was found with the given ID. And of course we need to end this if conditional block here. We can do that with that syntax there. Let's go back to the page, and you can see we get the message, the 𝗖𝗵𝗽𝗀𝗲𝗲 directed by Coen Brothers. If we go to the URL 1 here, we get the Godfather. But if we go to one URL that doesn't exist, that has no ID within the store, such as 55, we get the message that no film was found with that ID. So this is a very primitive application at the moment. We have a Svelte store in the background that's storing the details for all of the films in our system, and you can see them listed on the page here. And we're also able to click these films and get the messages for that particular film. So it's a detail page for the individual film. We can view information, and we have in the URL a dynamic argument, and we're using the Svelte routing system in order to get these IDs and in order to generate these routes in our application. We've seen in this video how to use the page.svelte files to define the page that is rendered when you actually go to a URL, and we've also seen how to use this page.js file. We can use this to provide a component with data that it needs before it's rendered, and that can be things like dynamic arguments from the URL, and you can see that that's done here. We have an ID that's dynamic in this URL route, and that is then accessed from the params passed into this loading function, where we access params.id and return a key with the name of ID, which is then accessed within the detail template using data.id. So I hope that all makes sense. This has been a quick introduction. We've seen a number of things about Svelte in this video. We've seen that a component is basically composed of a script tag, some HTML, and optionally some CSS. And we've seen things such as how to define conditional blocks with if and else statements, and also how to define loops within our Svelte HTML using this each expression. In the next video, we're going to see how to dynamically add new films to our store, and we're going to see how to work with events in Svelte. We'll see how to install a styling library in order to make the styles of this application a little bit better. That'll be in the next video. Beyond that, we'll implement a backend using Django and Django REST framework, and we'll gradually build the application out until it looks similar to what you saw at the start of this video. So thank you for watching this video. If you've enjoyed, please like and subscribe to the channel. If you're enjoying this content, please consider buying a coffee. There's a link in the description of the video for that, and we'll see you in the next video.